Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most bizarre economics lessons in medieval history. And fair warning, it involves way more dead sheep than you'd expect from a story about books. Picture this. You're a wealthy landowner in the year 1300, and you want to commission a Bible. The scribe looks you dead in the eye and says, "That'll be 300 sheep, please." And he's not joking. He's not asking for the sheep as payment. He needs their skins. All of them. Because that's what it actually took to create a single, complete Bible in the age before printing presses, before paper mills, before anyone had figured out a better way to preserve holy words than scraping the flesh off hundreds of animals and writing on what remained. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not going to beg, but if stories about medieval book production that cost more than a small house sound like your kind of bedtime content, then yeah, hit that button. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. I love seeing how this community spans time zones. Someone's eating breakfast in Tokyo, while someone else in Sao Paulo is fighting to stay awake. Here's the thing that gets me about this whole sheep situation. We think of books as cheap, disposable even. You can buy a paperback for less than a coffee. But in medieval Europe, a single Bible represented the death of an entire flock, months or even years of a scribe's life, and enough gold leaf to bankrupt a minor noble. Historians today still debate exactly how many animals went into the largest manuscripts. Some say 200 sheep for a modest Bible. Others argue the giant choir books required 400 or more. The math is fuzzy because record keeping was inconsistent, but everyone agrees. It was a lot of dead animals for one book. You're probably wondering why anyone would go through this trouble. Well, paper as we know it didn't exist in Europe until the very late medieval period, and even then, it was considered cheap and unworthy for sacred texts. Parchment, animal skin processed into a writing surface, was the gold standard. It was durable, it could last centuries, and most importantly, it could be scraped clean and reused if you made a mistake. Try doing that with papyrus. The Egyptians had their method, sure, but papyrus crumbled, it molded, it fell apart in European climates. Parchment could survive a monastery flood, a cold winter, even the occasional monk spilling sacramental wine on it. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. The process of turning a sheep into a writing surface was so labor-intensive, so chemically complex, and so absolutely disgusting that most monasteries had dedicated workers who did nothing else. These weren't the monks you picture in quiet contemplation. These were laborers standing knee-deep in lime pits, scraping rotting flesh, and breathing fumes that would make a modern OSHA inspector faint. And yet, this was considered holy work. You were preparing the material that would carry the word of God. Your hands might be covered in decomposing tissue, but spiritually, you were performing a sacred act. The medieval Scriptorium, the room where manuscripts were created, was part chemistry lab, part art studio, part endurance test. Monks worked in silence, in cold rooms, using inks made from compounds that could poison them, on surfaces that represented months of someone else's brutal labor. And they did this for decades. Some monks spent 40 years copying a single shelf's worth of books. When you see a medieval Bible in a museum, you're looking at what might represent the entire career of a human being, plus the lives of 300 sheep, plus ingredients sourced from across the known world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing outside a Benedictine monastery in northern France, sometime around the year 1250. The air smells like wet wool and wood smoke. Somewhere behind the stone walls, 300 sheep are about to have a very bad decade. Not all at once, thankfully, but gradually, as the monastery's parchment makers work through the flock. You don't know it yet, but you're about to become one of those parchment makers. And trust me, you're going to wish you'd chosen literally any other profession. Even mucking stables would have been cleaner. The abbot has just assigned you to the parchment workshop, which everyone simply calls the soak house. And that should have been your first clue that this job would be unpleasant. Your supervisor, a grizzled lay brother named Guillaume, who's missing 2 fingers from a scraping accident, hands you a leather apron that's stiff with dried Lord knows what and says, "Try not to vomit in the lime pit. It throws off the pH." You're not entirely sure what pH means in 13th century terms, but you understand the general warning. This is going to be rough. The Scriptorium itself sits on the 2nd floor of the monastery's east wing, as far as possible from the parchment workshop, because apparently even medieval monks understood the concept of keeping the horrible smells away from where you're trying to concentrate. You climb the stone stairs, your new leather shoes, because yes, you had to buy special shoes for this job, echoing in the narrow corridor. Guillaume pushes open a heavy oak door, and you step into a long, rectangular room with high windows that let in cold northern light. Your first thought is, this place is freezing. Your second thought is, why is everyone so hunched over? And your third thought, which comes about 5 seconds later when you notice the complete and utter silence, is, oh no, I'm going to have to work like this for the rest of my life, aren't I? There are 12 desks arranged in 2 rows, each one occupied by a monk bent over a slanted writing surface. Nobody looks up when you enter. Nobody acknowledges your presence at all. The only sounds are the scratch of quills on parchment, the occasional creak of a wooden chair, and somewhere in the corner, someone's stomach gurgling. You're about to whisper a question to Guillaume when he puts a finger to his lips so forcefully you think he might actually hit himself in the face. Right. The rule of Saint Benedict, silence during work hours, which you'll soon learn means silence for approximately 14 hours a day. Guillaume leads you to an empty desk near the back, the worst spot in the room because it's farthest from the windows and closest to the draft coming from the door. On the desk sits a single piece of parchment, a knife for scraping away mistakes, a pumice stone for smoothing the surface, a straight edge for ruling lines, and several quills in various states of wear. No ink yet. Apparently, you have to prove you can prepare a page properly before they trust you with the expensive stuff. Here's what nobody tells you about medieval manuscript production. It's not romantic. It's not peaceful monks in sunlit rooms contemplating the divine while gently transcribing beautiful words. It's 12 guys with chronic back pain, failing eyesight, and chilblains on their fingers, desperately trying to copy text without making errors that will require them to scrape away hours of work. The monk to your left has what looks like the medieval equivalent of carpal tunnel syndrome. His hand shakes so badly he has to stop every few minutes to massage his fingers. The monk to your right is at least 60 years old and squints so hard at his page that his face looks like it's trying to fold in on itself. You sit down. The wooden seat has been worn smooth by decades of other people's suffering, which is somehow not comforting. Guillaume places a copied page in front of you. It's a section from the Gospel of Luke, and gestures that you should begin ruling lines on your blank parchment so you can copy it. Ruling lines, you'll discover, is an art form in itself. You have to use the straight edge and a sharp stylus to press shallow grooves into the parchment without tearing it. Too light and your writing will drift. Too heavy and you'll puncture the surface, which on parchment that cost the equivalent of a week's wages is not great. You pick up the stylus. Your hand is already cramping, and you haven't even started. The parchment in front of you is cream-colored, slightly uneven, and if you look closely, which you do because you're procrastinating, you can see tiny hair follicles still embedded in the surface. This was a sheep, probably a young one given how fine the grain is. You're about to write Holy Scripture on what used to be a living animal, using tools that haven't changed much since ancient Rome, in a room so cold you can see your breath. Welcome to the Scriptorium. Historians still argue about whether this was the worst job in the medieval monastery, or merely one of the top 5 worst jobs. Some scholars point out that at least scribes weren't digging ditches or fighting wars. Others note that the combination of repetitive strain injuries, toxic ink exposure, poor lighting, and social isolation probably shaved years off these men's lives. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle, which is to say, this job was terrible. But in an era when most jobs were terrible, it was at least terrible indoors. You start ruling your lines. The monk across from you makes a small noise. Not quite a sigh, not quite a groan, just a tiny exhalation of despair. You glance up and see that he's made an error. Not a huge one, just a single letter in the wrong place, but he's now taking his scraping knife and carefully, so carefully, removing the ink. One wrong move and he'll tear the parchment. Tear the parchment and that's a sheep's worth of material ruined. Ruin too many sheep and the abbot starts asking uncomfortable questions about your competence. Here's a fun fact that nobody includes in romantic depictions of medieval monasteries. The monks left notes in the margins of their manuscripts, and those notes were not always pious. Some complained about the cold. Some complained about the quality of the parchment. One famous colophon from a German monastery reads, "Thank God, it will soon be dark," which is perhaps the most relatable thing ever written in the Middle Ages. Another scribe wrote, "The parchment is hairy," which seems petty until you realize he spent 6 months writing on that particular sheep and probably had opinions. Your first day in the Scriptorium lasts 9 hours. When Guillaume finally signals that you can stop, you stand up and immediately understand why everyone was hunched over. Your spine has forgotten how to be straight. Your right hand is locked in a claw shape around the stylus. Your eyes are burning from squinting at parchment in gradually dimming light. And you haven't even started the actual copying yet. This was just preparation. You follow the other monks downstairs to the refectory for dinner, which is bread, weak beer, and some kind of fish that's definitely seen better days. Nobody speaks. Everyone eats mechanically, and you notice that several of the older scribes have ink stains so deeply embedded in their fingers that they'll probably die with them. One monk has a tremor in his left hand that makes his spoon rattle against his bowl. Another keeps rubbing his eyes like he's trying to push his eyeballs back into proper focus. And tomorrow you'll do it all again, for the next 30 years. But before you can become a proper scribe, before you're trusted with the expensive inks and the important texts, you have to understand where your writing surface comes from. Which means Guillaume is taking you downstairs the next morning, past the kitchens, past the brewery, all the way to the building that sits downwind of everything else. The soak house. And the smell hits you about 50 feet before you reach the door. It's like someone combined a tannery, a butcher shop, and a latrine, then left the mixture in the sun for a week. Except there's no sun. It's October in northern France. Everything is just cold and wet and putrid. You step inside and immediately understand why Guillaume is missing those 2 fingers. This isn't a peaceful monastic workshop, but this is an industrial operation that happens to take place inside monastery walls. There are 3 large stone vats sunk into the floor, each one filled with liquid that ranges from cloudy white to disturbing brown. 2 lay brothers are working at a wooden frame stretched with what you initially think is fabric, but then realize, with creeping horror, is skin. Sheepskin. Still kind of fuzzy on one side. Still very much looking like it used to be part of an animal. Guillaume hands you a wooden pole with a hook on the end and gestures toward the first vat. "Lime pit," he says, which are apparently the only 2 words he knows how to say quietly. 3 days in the lime solution loosens the hair and flesh. You're going to pull one out, scrape it, and put it in the second vat. Try not to splash the lime in your eyes. Brother Thomas did that last year, and he still can't see properly out of his left eye. You want to ask if Brother Thomas received any medical treatment, but you already know the answer. Probably some prayers, and maybe a compress made of herbs that did absolutely nothing. This is the 13th century. Workplace safety is not a concept that exists yet. You're just expected to not injure yourself, and if you do, well, that's between you and God. You hook the pole into the lime pit and pull up a dripping sheepskin. The lime solution, calcium hydroxide mixed with water, though you don't know the chemistry, has turned the skin pale and swollen. Clumps of wool are sliding off in wet chunks. There's still flesh attached in places, grey and soft and absolutely disgusting. Guillaume hands you a curved blade and demonstrates the scraping motion, long, even strokes, always pushing away from your body, removing the hair and subcutaneous fat without gouging the skin itself. You try. You immediately gouge the skin. Guillaume sighs, takes the blade back, and shows you again. The skin is weak right now, he explains. The lime has loosened everything. Too much pressure and you'll tear it. Too little and you'll leave material that will rot later. Feel the resistance. You want to point out that the only thing you're feeling is nausea, but you're already learning that in the parchment workshop. Complaining gets you nowhere. Here's something historians love to debate. Exactly how many sheep did it take to make a standard Bible? The numbers vary wildly depending on who you ask. Some manuscripts used calf skin, which is finer and smoother but requires more animals because calves are smaller. Some used sheep, which are larger but coarser. The truly expensive manuscripts, the ones made for kings and popes, sometimes used uterine vellum, which is exactly what it sounds like. The skin of stillborn or unborn calves, incredibly thin and smooth and horrifyingly wasteful. A complete Gutenberg Bible, produced just before printing technology, made all of this obsolete, used about 170 calf skins. Earlier handwritten Bibles used significantly more because the parchment was thicker and the pages larger. You scrape and scrape and scrape. Your arms are burning. The smell is permanently embedded in your nasal passages. Bits of wool and fat are flying everywhere, sticking to your apron, landing in your hair. Guillaume nods approvingly when you finish your first skin without tearing a hole in it, which feels like the lowest bar for approval ever set, but you'll take it. The skin goes into the second vat, which contains clean water. 2 days soaking to remove the lime, Guillaume says. Then it goes on the drying frame. He points to the wooden frames along the wall where dozens of skins are stretched tight with cords, looking like grotesque medieval drum heads. While it dries, we scrape it again, both sides this time. That's when it becomes parchment. You notice that some of the stretched skins have holes in them. Guillaume follows your gaze. Warble fly larvae, he says casually, like this is a normal thing to discuss. They burrow into the sheep's back while it's alive, leave holes in the skin, can't use those sections for writing. Sometimes you get a whole skin that's unusable because the sheep had too many parasites. He pauses. That's why we need so many animals. Not every skin is perfect. This is the part of medieval book production that museum exhibitions never quite convey. When you see a gorgeous, illuminated manuscript under glass, you're looking at the end result of a process that involved lime burns, accidental poisonings, ruined skins, and countless hours of genuinely unpleasant manual labor. The sheep didn't just die for this book. They died slowly over the course of months as the monastery's shepherds selected animals based on skin quality. Then the butchers processed them. Then the parchment makers spent weeks transforming corpses into writing surfaces. You spend 3 months in the soak house before Guillaume decides you're competent enough to move to the finishing stage. 3 months of pulling skins from lime pits, scraping flesh, stretching frames, and scraping again. Your hands develop calluses on top of calluses. The smell becomes so normal that you stop noticing it, which concerns you more than the smell itself. You've lost weight because the work is physically demanding, and the monastery's food is barely sufficient for people doing hard labor. But finally, Guillaume shows you the last step, the pumice stone. Once the skin is dry and scraped smooth on both sides, you rub it with pumice to create a slightly rough surface that will hold ink. Too smooth and the ink beads up. Too rough and it soaks in unevenly, making the letters blur. You have to get it exactly right, and exactly right is something you learn by feel, not measurement, which means you're going to ruin a lot of skins before you figure it out. After your purgatory in the soak house, you're finally promoted back to the Scriptorium, and honestly, the freezing cold and back pain feel like a vacation compared to scraping dead sheep for 12 hours a day. But Guillaume isn't done teaching you the ways of medieval suffering just yet. Before you can copy actual biblical text, you need to learn how to make ink. Which brings us to the fun part of this story. The part where everything is poisonous and nobody really understands why people keep getting sick. You follow Guillaume to a small workroom adjacent to the Scriptorium, basically a closet with a window and a workbench covered in stains that range from black to rust red to concerning greenish brown. There are clay pots everywhere, wooden boxes filled with strange organic matter, and a mortar and pestle that looks like it's seen things. Guillaume starts pulling ingredients from various containers, and you recognize exactly none of them except the vinegar, which you can smell from across the room. Iron gall ink, Guillaume announces, setting out what looks like a pile of lumpy brown nuts, a jar of iron nails soaking in liquid, and a chunk of tree sap. Used by scribes since Roman times. Permanent, water-resistant once it dries, and if you make it correctly, it'll last 1,000 years. He doesn't mention that if you make it incorrectly, it'll eat through the parchment like acid, or that the fumes from the fermentation process can give you headaches that last for days, or that prolonged exposure to the iron salts might be slowly poisoning everyone in this room. Those are things you'll discover on your own. The lumpy brown nuts are oak galls, basically tree tumors caused by wasp larvae. A wasp injects her eggs into an oak branch. The tree freaks out and forms a protective ball around the intrusion, and what you get is a ball of concentrated tannic acid. You're supposed to crush these into powder, which sounds simple until you try it and realize they're hard as rocks. You spend an hour grinding oak galls in the mortar, and by the end your arm feels like it might fall off. The powder smells like old wood and decay, which makes sense because it's literally a tree's immune response to being invaded by insects. Next, Guillaume shows you the iron salts. He's been soaking iron nails and scraps in vinegar or sour wine for weeks, which creates ferrous sulfate through a chemical process that won't be properly understood for another 500 years. All Guillaume knows is that when you mix the oak gall powder with the iron solution, something magical happens. The mixture turns black. Not immediately. It starts out pale, gray-purple, and darkens over several hours as it oxidizes. Medieval scribes called this ink ripening, which is a poetic way of saying, we're waiting for chemistry to happen. You're measuring out the oak gall powder when Guillaume adds, almost as an afterthought, try not to breathe too much of the dust. Brother Peter developed a cough after working with the ink for 20 years, and now he can't climb stairs without stopping to catch his breath. You freeze mid-pour. Is the ink dangerous? Guillaume shrugs, which is apparently medieval French for probably, but what are you going to do about it? Here's where historians really start arguing. How toxic was medieval ink, actually? We know it contained iron salts, tannic acids, and often additives like copper sulfate or verdigris to improve color and flow. We know scribes frequently complained of headaches, respiratory issues, and skin problems. We know that some recipes included ingredients we'd now classify as legitimately poisonous. But drawing a direct line between ink exposure and specific health outcomes is tricky when you're talking about people who also lived in cold, damp buildings, ate nutritionally questionable food, and had zero concept of germ theory or chemical safety. What we do know for certain is that medieval ink makers added gum arabic, tree sap from acacia trees imported from North Africa at considerable expense. To make the ink flow smoothly and stick to parchment, you're now stirring a glob of this gum into the iron oak gall mixture, and it's giving off fumes that make your eyes water. Guillaume hands you a stick to stir with and casually mentions that you should stir clockwise for luck. You're about to ask if the direction actually matters when you realize he's probably joking, but with medieval monks, it's genuinely hard to tell. The ink has to sit for at least a day before it's usable, which means you're finally going to start actual copying work tomorrow. Guillaume brings you back to your desk in the Scriptorium and sets down a fresh piece of parchment, one of your own scraped skins from the soak house, which feels both satisfying and slightly disturbing. He places a completed page next to it, a section from the Book of Genesis, written in the careful Carolingian minuscule script that's standard for biblical texts. Your job is to copy it, exactly, letter for letter, line for line. No creativity, no interpretation, just flawless mechanical reproduction. Start with ruling your lines, Guillaume instructs. You pick up the stylus and straight edge, and suddenly all those weeks of practice make sense. You rule horizontal lines to keep your text straight and vertical lines to mark margins. You prick tiny holes along the edges of the parchment to guide your straight edge, a technique that will leave permanent marks but ensures consistency across pages. Every page of a medieval Bible has these little holes marching down the margins, evidence of the measuring and planning that went into making text look uniform. The next morning, your ink is ready. It's thick, black, and smells like vinegar and rust. Guillaume tests it by drawing a line on scrap parchment. The ink flows smoothly, doesn't bleed, and starts drying within seconds to a deep black that shows no sign of fading. Good batch, he says, which is apparently high praise. He hands you a freshly cut quill. You'll learn to cut your own later, and shows you how to dip just the tip into the ink, how to wipe the excess on the edge of the pot, how to apply pressure for thick strokes and lighten up for thin ones. Your first letter is terrible. The ink blobs. Your hand shakes. The angle is wrong. Guillaume makes you scrape it off and start again. Your second attempt is slightly less terrible. Your third attempt is actually readable, though it's nowhere near the professional quality of the exemplar page. You'll write that same letter about 5,000 times before it looks right, Guillaume says cheerfully. And there are 23 letters in the Latin alphabet, plus abbreviations and ligatures. You do some quick mental math and realize you're looking at roughly 100,000 practice letters before you'll be trusted with actual Bible pages. And that's just the letter forms. That doesn't include learning the abbreviations medieval scribes used to save parchment space, or mastering the difference between textualis and rotunda scripts, or developing the muscle memory to maintain consistent letter height and spacing across an entire page. 3 months into your training as a scribe, Guillaume taps you on the shoulder during afternoon copying and gestures for you to follow him. You're relieved for the break. Your hand has been cramping for the last hour, but also suspicious because Guillaume never interrupts work unless something important or terrible is about to happen. Usually terrible. You follow him down the corridor to yet another small workroom, this one bathed in better light than the ink-making closet. There are shelves lined with small wooden boxes, ceramic bowls containing powders in colors you didn't know existed, and in the corner, a monk you've never seen before, grinding something in a mortar with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for prayer. "This is Brother Aldrich," Guillaume says. "He's our illuminator. You're going to learn pigment preparation." You glance at the boxes and bowls with their brilliant reds, blues, greens, and golds, and think, oh, this might actually be pleasant for once. Then Brother Aldrich looks up, and you notice his hands are stained a concerning shade of red-orange. His fingernails are permanently blue, and there's a tremor in his left hand that makes the pestle rattle against the mortar. He smiles, revealing teeth with a grayish tint, and says, "Welcome to the poison room." He's not entirely joking. Creating the vivid colors that make illuminated manuscripts so breathtaking requires grinding, mixing, and applying minerals and compounds that range from mildly irritating to legitimately deadly. That brilliant red you see in initial letters could be cinnabar, which is mercury sulfide. The bright white used for highlights, lead white, made by exposing lead to vinegar fumes. The gorgeous blue that costs more than gold. Ultramarine, ground from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, and while it's not toxic, the cheaper alternative, azurite, often contains copper compounds that definitely are. Brother Eldrick hands you a small piece of what looks like red rock. Cinnabar, he confirms. You're going to grind this into powder fine enough to paint with. Use the stone mortar, not the bronze one. Metal tools can contaminate the pigment. Grind in a circular motion, steady pressure, and for the love of St. Jerome, don't breathe the dust. You want to ask what happens if you breathe the dust, but Aldrich's grey teeth are probably answer enough. Mercury poisoning was a genuine occupational hazard for medieval illuminators, though they didn't understand the connection between the pretty red powder and the tremors, tooth loss, and neurological problems that developed after years of exposure. You start grinding. The cinnabar is surprisingly hard, and it takes real effort to break it down into powder. Your arm is aching within minutes, and you've barely made a dent in the small chunk Aldrich gave you. He's moved on to preparing lead white, which involves scraping oxidized lead from metal sheets that have been hanging in a sealed pot above vinegar. The white flakes drift in the air like snow, catching the light, looking absolutely beautiful and absolutely toxic. Here's what makes medieval pigment preparation so fascinating to art historians. These weren't standardized chemical processes. Every monastery, every scriptorium, every illuminator had slightly different recipes passed down through workshop tradition. Some added honey to make paint flow better. Some used egg white as a binder. Some insisted that grinding pigments during certain phases of the moon produced better colors, which obviously wasn't true. But when your entire craft is based on trial and error rather than chemical understanding, you develop superstitions. Modern scientists analyzing medieval manuscripts sometimes find unexpected compounds in the paint layers, evidence that scribes were experimenting, substituting ingredients, trying to achieve specific effects without really knowing why certain combinations worked. Brother Aldrich shows you the gold. Not gold paint, actual gold. Thin sheets of it, beaten so fine you can see light through them, ready to be applied to parchment and burnished to a reflective shine. Gold leaf for the most important initials and borders, he explains. Costs more than the parchment, more than the ink, more than everything else combined. One sheet this size, he holds up a piece about 3 inches square, costs what a laborer earns in a week. You'll practice with brass first. The brass powder is less expensive but still requires careful preparation. You mix it with gum arabic and water to create a paste that can be painted onto parchment. Once dry, you burnish it with a smooth stone or a dog's tooth. Yes, literally a polished dog's tooth to make it shine. It looks impressive, almost like real gold, but it tarnishes over time. Real gold never does, which is why the wealthiest patrons insisted on it. When you see a medieval manuscript with gold illumination that still gleams after 700 years, you're looking at material wealth that would have fed a small village for months, applied one tiny letter at a time. Aldrich lets you practice on scrap parchment, painting simple decorative borders with the pigments you've prepared. The cinnabar red goes on smoothly, dries quickly, and looks absolutely stunning. You're actually enjoying yourself for the first time since entering the monastery. Then Aldrich mentions, almost casually, try not to lick the brush to point it. Brother Maurice used to do that with the lead white, and his hands started shaking so badly he had to stop illuminating. Took him 3 years to die after that. You freeze with the brush halfway to your mouth. A habit you'd picked up without thinking about it, the way every artist since the invention of paint has pointed their brush with their lips. The realization hits you. This beautiful art form is actively dangerous. Every pigment you're using either is toxic or could become toxic through improper handling. The vermilion made from cinnabar releases mercury vapor when heated. The verdigris, copper acetate used for brilliant greens, can burn your skin. The lead white that makes such perfect highlights accumulates in your body, causing symptoms that medieval medicine attributed to imbalanced humors or divine punishment rather than industrial poisoning. But here's the thing that really gets historians debating. How aware were medieval craftsmen of these dangers? Some margin notes suggest they knew certain materials were harmful. There are warnings about not heating cinnabar, cautions about washing hands after working with verdigris. But other evidence suggests they didn't connect long-term exposure with chronic illness. They knew that some pigments caused immediate problems like skin irritation or headaches. But the slow accumulation of heavy metals, the gradual neurological damage, the respiratory issues from years of inhaling dust, those developed too slowly to draw clear cause and effect lines. You spend the afternoon grinding pigments, and by evening your hands are stained multiple colors, and your lungs feel slightly tight from breathing air filled with microscopic particles of minerals that have no business being inside a human body. Brother Aldrich seems pleased with your work, which you suppose is good, though you're starting to wonder if every compliment in this monastery is just confirmation that you've successfully done something dangerous without immediately dying. It's been 6 months since you entered the Scriptorium, and you're finally trusted to work on actual Bible pages. Not practice sheets, not scrap parchment, but the real thing. The abbot has commissioned a complete Vulgate Bible for the monastery's library, a project that will take years and involve 4 scribes working in rotation. You're the junior member of the team, which means you get the easiest sections, the genealogies, the repetitive legal codes from Leviticus, the parts where, if you make a mistake, it's tedious to fix but not theologically catastrophic. The senior scribes handle the Gospels, the Psalms, the important prophetic books where errors could be interpreted as heresy. Guillaume sets a fresh quill in front of you. You've learned to cut your own by now, shaping goose feathers into precise writing instruments with a penknife that you keep sharper than most people keep their eating knives. The quill needs to be cut at a specific angle to produce the thick and thin strokes of Carolingian script, and the tip needs to be recut every few hours as it wears down. You've gone through approximately 200 goose feathers in your training, which is its own kind of small-scale slaughter, though significantly less dramatic than the sheep situation. Your posture is everything. You're sitting on a bench that's slightly too low, which forces you to hunch forward over the slanted desk. Your left hand holds the parchment steady, or grips a straight edge if you're ruling lines, while your right hand does all the work. Your feet are flat on the floor for stability. Your neck is craned at an angle that will, over the course of several decades, permanently curve your spine. Every medieval scribe who made it to old age had a distinctive posture. Shoulders rolled forward, head jutting out, one hand gnarled into a permanent writing claw. Modern doctors who study medieval skeletal remains have identified what they call scribe's back, specific patterns of spinal degeneration and bone changes consistent with thousands of hours in this exact position. Some skeletons show evidence of thoracic kyphosis, an excessive forward curve of the upper spine. Others show repetitive stress injuries in the wrist and hand bones, grooves worn into finger bones where the quill rested, even changes in shoulder joint structure from the constant forward reach. You're 23 years old, and you're already developing the posture that will mark you as a scribe for the rest of your life. You dip your quill in the iron gall ink and begin. The first letter of each section needs to be slightly larger, so you've ruled extra space for it. Your hand moves in the practiced motions you've drilled for months. Downstroke with pressure, lift for the thin cross stroke, curve for the rounded portions. The parchment accepts the ink beautifully. This is a good skin, well prepared, with just enough tooth to hold the pigment without absorbing too much. You can feel the quality through the quill, the way a musician can feel the quality of an instrument through their fingers. The first line takes you 12 minutes. That seems slow until you do the math. A standard Bible page contains about 40 lines of text. At 12 minutes per line, you're looking at 8 hours for a single page. And a complete Bible is around 1,200 pages. You're going to spend years, literally years of your life, hunched over parchment, reproducing text that already exists, letter by letter, word by word, fighting against hand cramps and failing light and the cold that makes your fingers stiff and clumsy. Here's what historians find fascinating about medieval copying. The error rate was surprisingly low, but the errors that did occur tell us interesting things about how scribes worked. Most mistakes were substitutions of similar-looking letters, suggesting eye strain and poor lighting. Some were hearing errors, places where the scribe clearly misheard a word being read aloud, which tells us that some scriptoriums worked with one person reading, while others copied, like a medieval assembly line. And some errors were just mental slips, the kind that happen when you're doing repetitive work for hours, skipping lines, repeating phrases, swapping word order. You work through the morning, finishing 3 pages by the time the bell rings for midday prayers. Your hand is cramping, your back is on fire. Your eyes are watering from the strain of focusing on tiny letters in light that, while better than candlelight, still isn't great for detailed work. You stand up, and your spine makes a series of concerning cracking sounds as it remembers what vertical is supposed to feel like. The monk next to you, Brother Thomas, who's been doing this for 15 years, doesn't even react to the pain anymore. He just shuffles toward the chapel with the gait of a man whose body accepted permanent damage as the price of holy work. After prayers, there's a brief meal, and then you're back at your desk. The afternoon light is better, angling through the high windows at just the right slant to illuminate your work surface without creating harsh shadows. This is the premium working time, and everyone in the Scriptorium speeds up slightly, trying to maximize productivity during the good light hours. Because in winter, those good hours shrink to maybe 4 per day, and in summer they expand to 8 or 9, and your entire work schedule revolves around the sun because candles and oil lamps are expensive and create smoke that damages both parchment and lungs. You're midway through a genealogy. And Salah lived 30 years and begot Eber, and Salah lived 403 years after he begot Eber. When your quill catches on a slight imperfection in the parchment and splatters ink, just a small splatter, 3 letters ruined, but it might as well be a catastrophe. You grab your scraping knife with trembling hands. This is the moment every scribe dreads. You have to scrape away the wet ink without tearing the parchment, then smooth the surface with pumice, then re-rule the lines you've erased, then rewrite the letters perfectly so they match the surrounding text. One mistake, and you're looking at 20 minutes of repair work. Make too many mistakes, and Guillaume starts questioning whether you're cut out for this profession. You scrape. Carefully, carefully, holding your breath, using the blade at the precise angle Guillaume taught you. The ink comes away in dark flakes. The parchment beneath is slightly fuzzy now, the surface damaged by the scraping. You use the pumice stone in gentle circular motions, smoothing it back down. Re-rule the lines with your stylus. Let your hand steady. Dip the quill. Write the letters again, trying to match the exact size and spacing of the surrounding text so the repair isn't obvious. It takes 18 minutes. 18 minutes to fix 3 letters. And you'll make dozens of these mistakes over the course of the project, because you're human and humans make mistakes, especially when they're doing detail work for 12 hours a day in imperfect light, with hands that hurt and eyes that water, and backs that scream for mercy. The worst part about making a mistake isn't even the time lost fixing it. It's the fact that every error you make gets noted. Not officially, not in any written record, but Guillaume knows. The senior scribes know. The abbot, who occasionally visits the Scriptorium to check on progress, definitely knows. In a monastery, where silence is the rule and communication happens through gestures and meaningful looks, your competence is constantly being evaluated without a word being spoken. You've seen it happen to others. A scribe who makes too many errors gets quietly reassigned to less important work, copying administrative documents or record books instead of scripture. It's not quite a demotion, but everyone understands what it means. So you develop paranoia. Every letter gets checked twice. Every line gets examined for consistency before you move to the next one. You start having dreams where you've written an entire page only to discover, in that horrible dream logic way, that every single word is misspelled. You wake up in the dormitory, your right hand already tensing into writing position, and have to consciously relax your fingers before they cramp. This level of anxiety isn't unusual. Historians studying medieval manuscript margins have found countless notes from scribes expressing their psychological state, and it's rarely positive. One Irish monk wrote, "Oh, my hand," after completing a particularly difficult page. A German scribe added, "This parchment is hairy and the ink is thin." Another left a note that translates roughly to, "The page is finished, but my spirit is broken." These weren't men finding deep spiritual fulfillment in their work. These were craftsmen doing difficult, tedious labor under conditions that tested the limits of human patience. You're working on a particularly complex page from the Book of Numbers, a census list with names you can barely pronounce, let alone spell correctly, when something shifts in your peripheral vision. Brother Thomas, 3 desks down, has gone completely still. Not the normal stillness of concentration, but a frozen, stricken stillness. You glance over and see the problem immediately. He's just finished ruling lines on a fresh page and has discovered, too late, that he ruled 42 lines instead of 40. The exemplar page has 40 lines. Every page in this Bible has 40 lines. That's the format, that's the standard, and he's just prepared a page with the wrong number of lines. The parchment cost the equivalent of a week's worth of monastery food budget. It represents hours of work in the soak house. And it's now essentially useless for this project because even if Brother Thomas scrapes away the ruled lines and starts over, the parchment will be damaged, the surface compromised, and the page will look different from its neighbors when the book is bound. Guillaume notices the silence, the absence of Thomas's usual scratching quill, and comes over. He examines the page. He looks at Thomas. He doesn't say anything because speaking in the Scriptorium is forbidden, but his expression says everything. This is a costly mistake, and we all just lost time and materials because of a moment's inattention. Thomas will use that parchment for something else. Maybe a practice sheet, maybe a document that doesn't require perfection. But it won't be part of the Bible. And somewhere in the monastery's account books, someone will have to note that another sheep's worth of material has been consumed without producing the intended result. Multiply this by hundreds of monasteries across Europe, all producing manuscripts, all dealing with inevitable human error, and you start to understand why medieval books were so staggeringly expensive. It wasn't just the materials and the labor, it was the waste inherent in any human manufacturing process. You finish your page without incident, though your hand is shaking from second-hand anxiety. Guillaume approves it with a nod, which means you can move it to the drying rack and start on the next one. The completed pages sit on a wooden rack near the window, allowing the ink to fully oxidize and dry. Iron gall ink does something chemically interesting as it dries. It actually gets darker over the first few days, and it bonds with the parchment at a molecular level. This is why medieval manuscripts can last for centuries while modern ballpoint pen ink fades in decades. The iron in the ink literally etches itself into the writing surface. But here's the problem that medieval scribes discovered but couldn't explain. If you made the ink too acidic or used too much iron sulfate, the ink would eventually eat through the parchment. Not immediately, sometimes not for a century. But eventually, letters would be surrounded by brown halos and the parchment would become brittle and crack. Modern conservators working with medieval manuscripts encounter this all the time. Ink burn, they call it, where the chemical composition of the ink has degraded the very surface it was meant to preserve. Some manuscripts are so damaged by their own ink that they're crumbling away, despite being stored in perfect archival conditions. Nobody in your scriptorium knows this yet, of course. You're all following recipes passed down from earlier generations, assuming that if the ink looks right and writes well, it must be correct. The idea that you're potentially creating a time bomb that will destroy your work 500 years from now hasn't occurred to anyone. Because why would it? The oldest manuscripts in your monastery's library are 200 years old and seem fine. The fact that some of them are already showing early signs of ink burn, subtle browning around the letters, just looks like aging, not chemical degradation. You start your next page. This one is from Deuteronomy, another legal code, another endless list of rules and regulations. Your mind wanders while your hand continues its practiced motions, which is dangerous because wandering minds make mistakes. You think about the sheep that died to become this parchment. You think about the oak tree that got infested with wasps to produce the galls you ground into ink. You think about Brother Thomas's ruined page and wonder how many mistakes you're allowed before you become a liability. The afternoon stretches on. The light begins to shift, becoming more orange, less blue. Guillaume circulates through the Scriptorium, checking everyone's progress, occasionally gesturing for someone to adjust their letter spacing or recut their quill. The silence is profound, not peaceful exactly, but heavy, loaded with concentration and suppressed discomfort. 12 men in one room, all in pain to various degrees, all pushing through it because this is the work, and the work must be done. Your hand cramps badly enough that you have to stop. You set down the quill and flex your fingers, trying to work out the knot that's formed in your palm. This happens more frequently now, the longer you work. The repetitive motion of gripping the quill, the constant fine motor control, it's taking a toll. In another 10 years, your hand will hurt all the time. In 20 years, you might develop what modern doctors would recognize as severe arthritis. But there's no workers' compensation in the 13th century. There's no ergonomic assessment. There's just the work, and your body's gradual surrender to the demands of the work, and the quiet understanding that this is what you signed up for when you took your vows. 2 years into your career as a scribe, Guillaume makes an announcement that fills you with equal parts excitement and dread. You're being trained in illumination. Not full-time. Brother Aldrich is still the monastery's primary illuminator, but you'll be learning to create the decorative initials, the vinework borders, the small illustrations that transform a simple text block into a work of art. This is simultaneously an honor, a recognition of your skill, and a guarantee that you'll be exposed to even more toxic substances than you're already working with. Your hands, already permanently stained with iron gall ink, are about to become a rainbow of metallic poisoning. The first lesson Aldrich teaches you is about patience, which seems redundant given that you've spent 2 years copying text letter by letter, but illumination requires a different kind of patience. When you're writing text, you're in a rhythm. Your hand knows the motions. The letters flow in practiced sequences. Illumination is different. Every brush stroke is deliberate. Every color application requires waiting for the previous layer to dry completely. Rush the process, and colors bleed together, gold leaf wrinkles. The whole piece looks muddy and amateur. You're starting with a simple decorated initial, the letter I that begins the book of Isaiah. On the exemplar page Aldrich shows you, this letter is about 3 inches tall, surrounded by delicate vine scrollwork in red and blue, with tiny gold dots along the vertical stroke. It looks simple. It is not simple. Aldrich hands you a piece of practiced parchment and a brush so fine it's made from a single squirrel hair. The outline first, he instructs. Red ochre, very thin. You're just mapping where everything goes. Red ochre is one of the safer pigments, which is why you're starting with it. It's literally just iron oxide, rust in mineral form, ground fine and mixed with binder. You dip your single hair brush into the thinned paint and attempt to draw the outline of the letter. Your hand shakes, the line wavers. You're used to the controlled pressure of a quill against parchment. The brush feels weird, too soft, too responsive. The paint goes down unevenly. Aldrich watches without comment, which somehow feels more judgmental than if he'd pointed out every flaw. You try again, and again. You go through a dozen practice attempts before Aldrich nods approval at your outline. Now we wait for it to dry, he says. Completely dry. If you apply the next layer while this is still wet, everything smears. So you wait. In a modern context, you'd check your phone, maybe grab a coffee. In a medieval scriptorium, you wait by moving to a different task. You can work on text pages while the paint dries. But it breaks your concentration, interrupts the flow. Illumination, you're realizing, is a series of interruptions, of forced pauses, of patience layered on patience. Once the outline is dry, Aldrich shows you how to fill it with color. You're using azurite blue for the letter itself. Not the expensive ultramarine from Afghanistan, but the more affordable copper-based blue that's locally available. It goes on smoothly, a rich medium blue that looks gorgeous against the cream parchment. Then Aldrich points out that you've painted slightly outside your outline in 2 places. This is why we do the outline first, he says, handing you a damp cloth. Wipe it away before it dries. You carefully remove the excess paint, trying not to disturb the parts you want to keep, and the whole process feels like diffusing a bomb. Here's something art historians debate constantly. How much did medieval illuminators understand about color theory? They clearly knew certain combinations worked well together: red and blue, gold and green, white highlights against dark backgrounds. They understood that some pigments were transparent and others opaque, that layering colors could create new effects. But did they understand complementary colors in the way we teach them now? Did they think about warm versus cool tones, or were they working purely from tradition and experimentation? The evidence suggests it was mostly the latter. Recipe books and workshop manuals from the period contain instructions like grind the azurite until it's as fine as flour, and add egg white until the mixture flows from your brush without dripping, but rarely explain why these proportions work or what the underlying principles are. Medieval craftsmen were phenomenal empiricists. They figured out what worked through trial and error, but the theoretical framework wouldn't develop for centuries. You're applying gold leaf now, which is its own special kind of terror. The leaf is so thin that breathing too hard will send it floating away. Aldrich has you practice with brass leaf first, which is cheaper and more forgiving. You paint a thin layer of adhesive, glaire, made from egg white beaten until it's foamy and then left to settle, onto the areas where you want gold to appear. Let it dry until it's tacky, but not wet. Then, using tweezers and the steadiest hands you've ever had to maintain, you lay the brass leaf onto the adhesive. It wrinkles immediately. You've created a crease in the metal that will be visible forever. Aldrich sighs. The adhesive was too wet, he diagnoses. You have to wait longer, and when you lay the leaf, don't press. Just place it and let it settle on its own. You try again with a fresh piece of leaf. This time you wait until the adhesive is almost dry, barely tacky. The leaf goes down smoothly, clinging to the adhesive, and you feel a surge of accomplishment before Aldrich points out that you missed a small section and now there's a gap in the coverage. This is the reality of illumination. It's fiddly, unforgiving work that requires perfect timing, steady hands, and the ability to work in layers that each must be exactly right, or the whole piece fails. And you're doing this with materials that cost more than most people's annual income. That tiny piece of brass leaf you just wasted. Cheap compared to real gold, but still expensive. Real gold leaf, the kind used in high-status manuscripts, costs roughly the same per sheet as a skilled craftsman earns in a week. You'll practice with brass for months before Aldrich trusts you anywhere near the real thing. The vine scrollwork that decorates the borders is its own specialized skill. You're using a different brush now, slightly thicker, with a pointed tip that can create both fine lines and broader strokes depending on pressure. The vines curl in stylized patterns, not realistic plant growth, but decorative abstraction. Red and blue alternate, twining around each other, with tiny leaves sprouting at regular intervals. It looks spontaneous and organic, but it's actually carefully planned. Aldrich has you sketch the whole design first in very light lead point, mapping out where each curve goes, where the colors change, where the leaves appear. You paint the red vines first. The cinnabar goes down smoothly, that brilliant vermilion red that makes medieval manuscripts so visually striking. You're being careful not to breathe the dust when you mix the powder, working in small batches to minimize exposure. The tremor in Aldrich's hand is a constant reminder of what prolonged exposure can do. He's been doing this for 30 years, and the mercury has accumulated in his body to the point where his nervous system is permanently affected. He knows it. Everyone knows it, and yet he's teaching you the same techniques, using the same materials, because this is how it's done, and changing the recipe might change the color, and that's unacceptable. Winter arrives like a punishment. You knew it would be cold. Guillaume warned you. The other scribes' hunched postures warned you. The entire design of the Scriptorium warned you. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it physically are very different things. The first truly cold morning, you climb the stairs to the Scriptorium and immediately understand why medieval scribes complained about winter in every margin note they could get away with. The room is absolutely frigid. Your breath comes out in visible clouds. The ink in the communal pot has a skin of ice on top that needs to be broken before anyone can work. Here's the cruel logic of medieval manuscript production. Fire is absolutely forbidden in the Scriptorium. One stray spark, one tipped candle, one smoldering ember, and decades of work goes up in flames. Parchment burns beautifully. It's essentially thin leather, full of fat and protein. The wooden desks would catch. The wooden shelves holding completed pages would ignite. The entire room would become an inferno in minutes, and medieval firefighting technology consisted of throw water on it and pray. So no braziers, no warming fires, no heat source of any kind. You work in whatever temperature the stone walls and weak winter sunlight provide, which in January in northern France is somewhere between uncomfortably cold and question your life choices. You sit at your desk, wrap your cloak tighter around your shoulders, and try to hold your quill with fingers that have gone numb. This is actually impossible. You can't do detailed work with numb fingers. You can't feel the pressure, can't control the angle, can't make the precise movements that clean letter forms require. So you do what every scribe has done since the invention of cold weather. You tuck your hands into your armpits for a few minutes, warm them back to minimal functionality, write as much as you can before they go numb again, then repeat. This process extends a normal page from 8 hours to 12 or more, because you're spending half your time just trying to maintain enough dexterity to hold a pen. The ink freezes in your pot. Not solid, it's too full of alcohol and gum arabic for that. But it gets thick and sluggish, refusing to flow properly from your quill. You have to keep a small amount in a separate container tucked inside your robe, using body heat to keep it liquid. This means you're constantly transferring fresh ink from your inner pocket to your quill, and if you're not careful, you'll spill it on yourself, which is how you end up with permanent ink stains on the inside of your habit that look vaguely suspicious to anyone who doesn't know about the winter ink warming technique. Brother Thomas, who's been doing this for 15 years, has developed chilblains on his fingers, painful inflammation caused by repeated exposure to cold. His fingertips are swollen and red, cracking at the knuckles, and every time he grips his quill, you can see him wince. But he doesn't stop. Nobody stops. The work continues through winter because commissioned manuscripts have deadlines, and wealthy patrons who've paid for a Bible don't care that the scribe's hands are developing frostbite. Actually, that's not entirely fair. Most patrons probably had no idea what conditions were like in winter scriptoriums. The disconnect between the beautiful finished product and the misery of its creation was complete. Historians studying medieval productivity have noticed something interesting. The number of pages produced per scribe drops dramatically in winter months. Account books from monasteries show that scribes completing 4 or 5 pages a day in summer might only finish 2 pages a day in January. Some of this is the shorter daylight hours. You lose working time when the sun sets at 4 in the afternoon, but a lot of it is just the cold. Cold hands work slower. Cold bodies tire faster. Cold brains have trouble concentrating. The entire operation downshifts into a survival mode where you're just trying to get through the day without completely losing feeling in your extremities. The parchment behaves differently in cold weather too. In summer, it's supple and forgiving. In winter, it becomes stiff and brittle. If you're not careful, it can crack along fold lines or split where you've scraped away an error. The pumice stone that smooths the surface in warm weather can actually scratch it when everything's cold and inflexible. You have to adjust your technique, use a lighter touch, accept that the parchment won't respond the way you're used to. It's like the materials themselves are suffering alongside you. The only advantage, and this is a very small advantage, is that the cold slows down the bugs. In summer, you're constantly fighting insects attracted to the gum arabic in the ink, tiny beetles that eat the parchment sizing, moths that want to lay eggs in the wool fibers of your clothing. In winter, at least the bugs are dormant. Small mercies. You're attempting to illuminate an initial letter, which in cold weather becomes almost farcically difficult. The paint thickens. Your brush hand shakes from cold, not from the controlled tremor of precise brushwork. The gold leaf, when you're finally trusted with real gold, becomes even more temperamental because the adhesive dries differently in cold air. You're supposed to wait until it's tacky, but in winter it seems to go from wet to completely dry without passing through tacky, and you miss your window and have to start over. Brother Aldrich works through winter with his hands wrapped in fingerless mittens, exposing only the fingertips he needs for holding brushes. It looks ridiculous, but it's functional. The other scribes have started adopting similar solutions. Scraps of wool wrapped around palms, old socks with the ends cut off, anything to keep some warmth in while leaving fingers free for detailed work. The Scriptorium in January looks less like a holy workshop and more like a gathering of cold, miserable men wearing improvised hand coverings and trying not to complain out loud. The abbot makes an inspection visit on a particularly brutal February morning. He walks through the Scriptorium, examines the work in progress, and you can see him calculating in his head. How much is the cold costing us in lost productivity? How many fewer pages will we complete this year because our scribes are working with frozen hands? But there's no solution. You can't heat the room. You can't pause the work until spring. You just have to endure it, the same way every generation of scribes has endured it, and hope that your hands don't suffer permanent damage from the repeated freezing and thawing. Some scribes do suffer permanent damage. You've heard stories about older monks who can no longer straighten their fingers because years of cold weather work have locked their joints in a permanent curl. The monastery physician, a well-meaning brother with absolutely no medical training beyond reading classical texts, recommends various treatments: warming the hands in heated wine, rubbing them with goose fat, praying to Saint Luke, who's somehow become the patron saint of cold fingers. None of it works particularly well, but at least it's something to do other than just suffer in silence. You've been working on the Bible project for 3 years now, and one day the monastery's bursar, the monk who handles all the financial records, comes to inspect the Scriptorium's progress. He's carrying a ledger, and he's doing calculations that make his face progressively more concerned. Guillaume notices and asks what's wrong. The bursar shakes his head and says, "Do you have any idea how much this Bible is costing?" Guillaume shrugs. Materials and time. Same as always. The bursar opens his ledger and starts reading numbers that make everyone in the room stop working. 340 sheep so far, and the project is only half finished. That's not counting the calves used for the finer pages in the Gospels, or the goats whose skin became the practice parchment you ruined during training. 15 pounds of iron for making ink, not because iron is expensive, but because it has to be soaked in vinegar for months, and vinegar costs money. 8 pounds of oak galls, purchased from merchants who collected them from forests across France. 2 pounds of gum arabic, imported from North Africa at prices that make you wince. And the gold leaf, the bursar actually closes his eyes when he reads this number. Enough gold to have bought a small farm. The total cost so far is approximately what a skilled craftsman would earn in 7 years. 7 years of solid wages, and the Bible isn't even finished yet. When it's complete, when it's bound in leather covers with metal clasps, when it's been decorated and illuminated and checked for errors, the monastery will own a book that cost more than most people's houses. And this is a relatively modest Bible, a working copy for the monastery library. The truly extravagant manuscripts commissioned by nobility or royalty could cost the equivalent of 20 years of labor or more. Here's what makes medieval book economics so fascinating to historians. These prices weren't considered outrageous. A Bible was supposed to be expensive. It contained the literal Word of God, preserved in the most durable format human technology could produce. Spending the equivalent of a house on it wasn't wasteful. It was appropriate. It was proportional to the value of the content. The fact that every page represented hours of skilled labor and materials sourced from across the known world was actually part of the point. This wasn't meant to be accessible. This was meant to be precious. But the economics created strange market distortions. Only the wealthiest institutions could afford to produce complete Bibles, which meant that most churches and monasteries worked with partial texts. A book of Gospels here, a Psalter there, a collection of Paul's letters. The idea of every Christian having personal access to a complete Bible was literally unthinkable, not just because of literacy rates, but because of pure material economics. There weren't enough sheep in Europe to give everyone a Bible. The math just didn't work out. You're thinking about this while you work on a page from Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And the irony isn't lost on you. You're creating an object of such extraordinary cost that it represents a kind of concentrated vanity in itself, a display of wealth and piety combined into one leather-bound package. The very act of producing it required killing hundreds of animals, poisoning scribes with toxic pigments, and investing thousands of hours of human labor, all to create something that will sit in the monastery library and be read maybe a few times a year during special services. The bursar continues his inspection, noting the completed pages stacked carefully on shelves, each one representing roughly a day's work and a sheep's worth of material. He's calculating replacement rates, how many sheep the monastery needs to acquire to continue the project, what that will do to the grazing land allocation, whether they can afford to purchase additional parchment from other monasteries if their own flock can't meet demand. Medieval manuscript production wasn't just a craft. It was an entire economic ecosystem involving shepherds, tanners, ink makers, pigment grinders, scribes, illuminators, and the complex supply chains that brought materials from across Europe and beyond. Guillaume mentions that one of the senior scribes is developing vision problems and might need to be reassigned to less detailed work. The bursar makes a note. This is also an economic calculation. Training a new scribe takes months, during which they're consuming materials and producing nothing usable. The monastery has invested years in developing its current team of scribes, and losing one to deteriorating eyesight or hand tremors or back problems represents a significant loss of capital. The human cost and the economic cost are completely intertwined, and neither takes priority over the other. They're just different ways of measuring the same resource depletion. You learn that the patron who commissioned this Bible, a wealthy merchant from Paris who's trying to secure his soul's salvation through generous donations, has paid half the cost up front and will pay the remainder upon completion. This is standard practice. Manuscript production is so expensive that it requires payment plans, sometimes stretching over years. Some contracts include penalty clauses if the work isn't completed by a certain date. Others specify exact materials. No brass leaf where gold was promised is apparently a common dispute that requires legal language. The bursar notices the page you're working on and asks to see it. You hand it over nervously. Financial inspectors make everyone nervous, even when you haven't done anything wrong. He examines it carefully, checking the evenness of your letters. the consistency of your spacing, looking for any flaws that might reduce the manuscript's value. He nods approval and hands it back, and you feel a weird surge of relief. Your work has been economically validated. You are contributing value equivalent to your cost, which in medieval terms is about as good as a performance review gets. Brother Thomas asks the bursar a question that's been bothering everyone. What happens if the patron dies before the Bible is finished? The bursar grimaces. This has happened before, apparently. The monastery is left with a partially completed manuscript that was customized for a specific patron. Maybe it includes his family coat of arms in the decorative borders, or prayers specific to his devotional preferences. Selling it to someone else requires renegotiation, often at a loss. Sometimes the patron's heirs honor the contract. Sometimes they don't, and the monastery ends up absorbing the cost of materials and labor with no payment forthcoming. This is the weird intersection of spiritual and economic that defines medieval manuscript culture. The monks doing the work are theoretically operating outside the money economy. They've taken vows of poverty. They don't personally benefit from the sale price. But the monastery as an institution is deeply embedded in economic reality. It needs income to support its members, maintain its buildings, and fund its charitable works. Manuscript production is one of the few ways a monastery can generate significant revenue, turning the labor of its monks into marketable commodities. You finish your page and add it to the growing stack. The bursar makes a notation in his ledger. One more page complete, one more sheep's worth of parchment converted into valuable manuscript. The equation is simple, even if the process isn't. Every page you produce adds economic value to the monastery. Every mistake you make destroys economic value. You're not just a scribe, you're a production unit in a medieval knowledge economy, and your productivity is being measured, tracked, and calculated with the same attention that a merchant gives to his warehouse inventory. The margins of medieval manuscripts are where the truth lives. This is something you learn after 4 years in the Scriptorium, when you've stopped being terrified of making mistakes and started being quietly, desperately miserable. The official text you're copying is sacred, untouchable, prescribed down to the letter. But the margins are yours. Within certain boundaries, you can't write anything heretical or obscene. You can leave notes for future readers, complaints for God, tiny windows into the actual experience of creating these supposedly timeless, holy objects. You're working on a particularly tedious section of Leviticus, copying laws about skin diseases and mildew that go on for pages and pages, when you notice that the exemplar you're working from has a tiny note in the margin, written in a different hand than the main text. It says, in abbreviated Latin, "Thank God this section is finished." You actually smile, which is rare in the Scriptorium. Some scribe, decades ago, felt exactly the way you feel right now and left a message across time. You're connected to him through shared suffering, through the common experience of having to maintain perfect concentration while copying material that puts your brain to sleep. Brother Aldrich's margins are more artistic than verbal. Tiny sketches of animals, grotesque faces, strange hybrid creatures that would never pass theological review if they weren't hidden in the white space around prayers. There's a theory among art historians that these marginalia represent a kind of psychological release valve, a place where the rigid control required by the main text can break down into playfulness or absurdity or honest complaint. When you're required to copy text letter perfect for 12 hours a day, the margins become a place to assert your own humanity. You've started leaving your own notes, though you're careful to keep them appropriate. The parchment is thin here. You write next to a section where the skin was scraped too aggressively during preparation. Cold day, stiff fingers. You note on a page completed during last winter. These seem trivial, but they're important to you, proof that you existed, that you suffered through this, that the beautiful finished product had a human cost. Someday, maybe centuries from now, someone will read your note and understand that you were a person, not just a production mechanism. Guillaume has been leaving margin notes for 30 years, and his have evolved from simple complaints to a kind of running commentary on the theological content he's copying. Next to a particularly stern passage about divine punishment, he's written, "God is just, but also, we are very tired." Next to a genealogy, more names than anyone needs to know. These aren't heretical. Guillaume is deeply pious, but they're honest in a way the official text can never be. They acknowledge the gap between ideal religious devotion and the practical reality of being a human being in a cold room with chronic back pain. The most famous margin note you've heard about, legendary among scribes, though none of you have seen the actual manuscript, supposedly reads, "I am very cold." That's it. No elaboration. Just 3 words summing up the winter Scriptorium experience with devastating brevity. You've repeated this phrase to yourself dozens of times during February mornings when your fingers were too numb to grip a quill. I am very cold. It's become a mantra, a shared piece of scribe culture passed down orally, because the written version exists in some monastery library none of you will ever visit. Some margin notes are curses. These are rarer, but they exist. May whoever steals this book be cursed with blindness and trembling hands. Let the thief of this manuscript know eternal damnation. These seem harsh until you remember that a single manuscript represents years of labor and material cost equivalent to a house. Book theft in the medieval period was a serious crime, and scribes who'd poured their lives into creating these objects had strong feelings about protecting them. The curses weren't just spiritual threats, they were also ownership marks, declarations that this object had value and identity and shouldn't be taken lightly. You've also seen margin notes that are desperately practical. Missing page and exemplar, text reconstructed from memory. Parchment torn here, text continued on next sheet. Ink recipe on this page, 1 part oak galls, 2 parts iron water, half part gum arabic. These are working notes, the kind of metadata that helps future scribes understand what they're looking at. They're also evidence that manuscript production wasn't a smooth, perfect process. It was full of compromises, repairs, and improvised solutions to unexpected problems. The most poignant margin notes are the ones about pain and exhaustion. My hand is weary. The light is failing, and so am I. 20 years I have labored in this place. These are rare. Most scribes maintain professional standards and didn't complain in writing. But when they appear, they're devastating in their simplicity. You're reading the words of someone who gave their body to this work and wanted some acknowledgement of the cost. Brother Thomas showed you his personal favorite margin note once from a manuscript he'd worked on early in his career. It said, "The parchment is hairy, the day is long, the beer is weak, and my soul yearns for sleep." This apparently became an inside joke among the scribes working on that project. They'd reference the hairy parchment whenever anything went wrong, and it became code for general frustration with working conditions. You have similar codes now. Oak gall weather for particularly bad days, iron hand for when your cramps are severe, small linguistic rebellions against the silence rule. Some monasteries forbid margin notes entirely, considering them unprofessional or distracting, but most allow them within reason, understanding that they serve a psychological function. The ability to leave some mark of your own personality, even just a tiny complaint or a date notation, makes the work slightly more bearable. You're not just a copying machine. You're a person who happened to make this copy, and the margins prove it. Historians study medieval marginalia obsessively because it's one of the few unfiltered sources of information about working conditions and attitudes. The official monastic chronicles present the ideal version of monastery life. The margin notes tell you what it actually felt like. They're how we know that scribes got bored, that they found some texts tedious, that they suffered from the cold and complained about their materials. They're time capsules of honest human reaction buried inside objects, meant to transcend human limitation. By your 5th year in the Scriptorium, you've started noticing things about your body that concern you. Your right hand shakes slightly when you're not actively writing, a fine tremor that wasn't there before. The vision in your left eye has gone a bit blurry. Not enough to stop you from working, but enough that you have to squint more than you used to. And there's a persistent metallic taste in your mouth that never quite goes away, like you've been sucking on old coins. You mentioned this to Brother Aldrich during one of your illumination lessons, and he just nods knowingly. Lead, he says simply, gets into everything. The occupational diseases of medieval scribes are something modern medical historians find fascinating, probably because they're so well documented in skeletal remains and contemporary accounts. You're essentially running a slow-motion experiment in what happens to the human body when you expose it to the same repetitive motions, toxic substances, and uncomfortable positions for decades. The results are not encouraging. Almost every long-term scribe develops multiple chronic conditions, and the combination of them creates a cascade of deteriorating health that medieval medicine has absolutely no ability to address. The hand tremor you're developing is probably from lead exposure. Lead white pigment, used for highlights and mixing lighter shades, gets everywhere. It's in the air when you grind it into powder. It's on your fingers when you mix it with binder. It settles on your work surface, on your clothing, on your food at meals because you can't completely wash it off your hands. Medieval monks didn't understand that lead accumulates in your body, that it crosses the blood-brain barrier, that it slowly damages your nervous system. They just knew that illuminators developed shakes after enough years, and they accepted it as part of the profession. Your vision problems are probably from 2 sources, the chronic eye strain from working in inadequate light, and possibly mercury exposure from the cinnabar you've been using. Mercury does horrible things to human neurology, and vision disturbances are one of the early symptoms. The fact that Brother Aldrich's teeth are gray isn't just poor dental hygiene. It's another mercury symptom. His hand tremor, which has gotten worse since you started training with him, is textbook mercury poisoning. In a modern context, he'd be immediately removed from exposure and monitored for neurological damage. In a medieval monastery, he keeps working until his hands shake too badly to hold a brush, and then he gets reassigned to less precise work. The respiratory problems are almost universal among scribes. You've developed a cough that's worse in the morning when you first enter the Scriptorium and start breathing air that's full of parchment dust, pigment particles, and the fumes from oak gall ink. Brother Thomas's cough is much worse. He's been doing this for 20 years, and sometimes he has to stop working because the coughing fits are so severe he can't hold his quill steady. The monastery physician has given him various herbal remedies that do absolutely nothing. Because the problem isn't an imbalance of humors or a spiritual ailment. It's chronic dust inhalation in a profession that doesn't have the concept of respiratory protection. Your back is permanently curved now. You can feel it when you try to stand straight. Your spine doesn't remember how to be vertical anymore. Your shoulders roll forward, your neck juts out. You look like every other long-term scribe, hunched, aged before your time, moving with the careful stiffness of someone whose skeleton has been molded into an unnatural shape by years of repetitive positioning. Modern chiropractors examining medieval skeletons can identify scribes by their bone structure alone. The thoracic vertebrae show specific patterns of compression and degeneration. The cervical spine shows unusual wear patterns. Even the bones in your hands show changes. Grooves where tendons have pulled against bone for thousands of hours. Alterations in joint structure from repetitive gripping motions. There's a monastery in Germany, you've heard, where they keep a record of how long scribes live versus other monks. The numbers aren't good. Scribes die younger, on average, and they spend more of their final years incapacitated by tremors, blindness, respiratory failure, and spinal degeneration. The monastery uses this information to argue for better compensation for scribes, extra food rations, exemption from certain physical labors, priority access to the infirmary. It's a medieval version of hazard pay, recognition that this profession has measurable health costs that deserve some kind of compensation. But here's the thing that makes medical historians debate. How much of the health deterioration is from toxic exposure versus just aging and hard labor in general? Medieval life expectancy wasn't great to begin with. Chronic malnutrition, poor sanitation, no effective medical treatment for most conditions. Everyone was dealing with these factors. Scribes had additional occupational hazards layered on top of baseline medieval unhealthiness. Separating cause and effect is difficult when everyone's health was compromised to some degree. What's clear is that long-term scribes knew they were sacrificing their bodies for their work. The margin notes prove it. Complaints about failing vision, cramping hands, weakening constitutions. They could see older scribes deteriorating and understand that they were looking at their own futures. And they kept working anyway, partly because they'd taken vows of obedience, partly because this was their profession and changing careers wasn't really an option, and partly because the work mattered. Despite the physical cost, they were creating objects of genuine importance, preserving knowledge, producing beauty. The suffering had meaning, even if the meaning didn't make the suffering hurt less. You're grinding azurite for an illumination project when you notice that your fingertips have gone numb. Not cold numb, which you're used to, but actually lacking sensation, like the nerves have stopped reporting. You mention this to Aldrich, and he shows you his own hands. The fingertips are shiny and smooth, the fingerprints worn away from years of handling toxic pigments and rough parchment. Nerve damage, he explains, happens to everyone eventually. You'll still be able to work, you just have to grip things tighter to compensate. This is said matter-of-factly, like he's explaining a normal progression rather than describing permanent disability. The metallic taste in your mouth gets worse after days when you're doing heavy illumination work. You've learned to recognize it as a warning sign. If the taste is strong, you're supposed to skip using lead white for a few days, give your body time to process what it's already absorbed. This is folk wisdom passed down through generations of illuminators, a rough form of exposure management that has no scientific basis, but probably does reduce the worst cases of acute poisoning. It's medieval industrial safety, crude, imperfect, but better than nothing. After 6 years of working with parchment, you've developed opinions about sheep. Strong opinions. Not all sheepskin is created equal, and the differences matter enormously when you're spending 12 hours a day staring at animal hide under magnification. You can tell, just by touching parchment, roughly how old the sheep was when it died, what time of year it was slaughtered, probably what region it came from based on the breed characteristics. This is not knowledge you ever wanted to have, but it's knowledge you've accumulated anyway through sheer, repetitive exposure. The best parchment comes from young sheep, ideally lambs between 6 months and a year old. The skin is thin, the grain is fine, and it takes ink beautifully without too much absorption or resistance. This is also, obviously, the most wasteful option. You're killing animals before they've reached full size, getting less writing surface per animal, requiring more deaths for the same number of pages. But the quality difference is significant enough that wealthy patrons specifically request lambskin, and the monastery charges accordingly. A lambskin Bible page costs roughly 30% more than a standard sheepskin page, and people pay it because the finished product is noticeably more refined. Calfskin, vellum technically, though scribes use the terms loosely, is even better. Finer grain, smoother surface, more uniform color. But calves are valuable agricultural animals, and slaughtering them for parchment represents a bigger economic loss than sheep. Most monasteries maintain sheep flocks specifically for parchment production, with shepherds selecting animals based on skin quality rather than wool or meat. Cattle are more complicated. You can't raise calves just for their skin the way you can with sheep. Most vellum comes from calves that died naturally or were culled for other reasons, which makes the supply unpredictable and the price volatile. And then there's uterine vellum, which you've only seen once, when a royal commission came through the monastery. The skin of stillborn or unborn calves, so thin it's almost translucent, so smooth it feels like fabric rather than leather. It takes ink like nothing else. Letters seem to float on the surface rather than sinking in. But the wastefulness is staggering. You're killing pregnant cows to harvest their unborn calves for skin, a practice that even medieval economics considered extreme. Only the wealthiest patrons used uterine vellum, and even then, only for the most important pages. Maybe the opening of each gospel, maybe a dedicatory page with the patron's portrait. The rest of the manuscript would use standard parchment. Here's what historians argue about constantly. How did medieval parchment makers decide which animals to use? We have some account books showing purchases and costs, but the decision-making process is murky. Did they prioritize male sheep because they were less valuable for breeding? Did they avoid older animals because the skin gets tougher and harder to work with? What happened to sheep that died of disease? Could you use that skin, or was it considered contaminated? The sources don't give us clear answers, just fragmentary evidence that has to be pieced together like a puzzle with missing pieces. You know from experience that sheep slaughtered in winter produce better parchment than sheep slaughtered in summer. Something about cold weather makes the skin tighter, less oily, more receptive to the lime and scraping process. Summer skins are greasier, harder to clean completely, more prone to developing problems during the drying phase. So, monasteries that could afford to be selective timed their slaughters for late fall and winter, building up parchment inventory when quality was highest. This required planning. You needed to estimate how much parchment you'd need for the next year's projects and make sure you had enough sheep in the flock to meet that demand. The flock management itself was complex. Sheep bred for parchment needed different characteristics than sheep bred for wool or meat. You wanted fine-grained skin, which often meant smaller animals with shorter wool. You wanted to avoid scars, which meant protecting the flock from predators and parasites more carefully than you would for meat animals. And you needed enough animals that you could cull selectively without depleting the breeding population. A monastery, serious about manuscript production, needed at least 200 sheep in its flock at any given time, probably more like 300 to maintain sustainable harvesting. The economics created weird situations. Some monasteries became known for high-quality parchment and started selling it to other scriptoriums rather than using it all themselves. This turned parchment production into a profit center separate from manuscript sales. You could make money just by managing your flock well and processing skins carefully. Other monasteries, especially smaller ones, bought parchment from specialists rather than trying to maintain their own flocks. There was an entire medieval parchment market, with traders carrying processed skins from monastery to monastery, negotiating prices based on quality and quantity. Brother Guillaume took you to inspect a new shipment of parchment once, teaching you how to evaluate quality. Hold it up to the light. You're looking for even thickness, no thin spots that might tear during writing. Feel the surface. Should be smooth but not slippery, with enough tooth to grip ink. Smell it. Bad smells indicate incomplete processing, residual rot, chemical problems that will cause issues later. Flex it gently. Good parchment has some give. Bad parchment is either too stiff or too floppy. Guillaume rejected about 30% of that shipment, sending it back to the supplier with detailed complaints about processing quality. The rejected parchment wasn't wasted. It got sold to a different buyer for non-biblical use. Account books, legal documents, practice sheets, letters, all the everyday writing that didn't require premium materials. This created a hierarchy of parchment quality that mapped onto a hierarchy of text importance. Sacred scripture got the best skins. Important legal documents got mid-grade material. Casual correspondence got whatever was left over. You could literally judge the importance of a medieval document by the quality of the animal skin it was written on. You've learned to identify specific parchment problems by sight. Warble fly holes, you can see where the larvae burrowed into the living sheep's back, leaving permanent marks in the skin. Healed scars from thorns or fights with other sheep. Uneven stretching during the drying process, which creates wrinkled sections. Poor scraping technique that left the surface too rough. Each flaw tells a story about the animal's life or the parchment maker's skill, and each flaw affects how well the page will accept ink and illumination. The 300 sheep that went into making a complete Bible weren't identical victims of a single process. They were individual animals with different qualities, different life histories, different skin characteristics. Some became the gorgeous opening pages of Genesis. Some became the utilitarian middle sections of Leviticus. Some got rejected for manuscript use and ended up as book bindings or document folders. The massive death toll wasn't just a number. It was 300 separate evaluations, 300 processing sessions, 300 judgments about whether this particular sheep's skin was good enough for the Word of God. It's the year 1455, and everything is about to change. You've been a scribe for 8 years now, your hands permanently stained with ink, your spine curved like a question mark. Your vision starting to fail in the way that all long-term scribes' vision eventually fails. You're working on yet another commissioned Bible, copying the book of Psalms for what feels like the 100th time in your career, when Brother Guillaume comes into the Scriptorium with an expression you've never seen before. He looks confused and worried and possibly excited, which is a lot of emotions for a man who usually communicates through meaningful silence and the occasional grunt. He's carrying a book, not a manuscript. You can tell immediately that something is different about this object. The pages are too uniform. The text is too perfect. Every letter is exactly the same height, exactly the same width, aligned with mechanical precision that no human hand could achieve. Guillaume sets it on the table and says, "This was made in Mainz, by a goldsmith named Gutenberg, without scribes." Without scribes. The words don't make sense initially. How do you make a book without scribes? Books are made by people sitting in cold rooms for years, copying text letter by letter, ruining their health in the process. That's how books work. That's how they've always worked. The idea that there could be another method is almost offensive, like suggesting that sheep could turn themselves into parchment or that ink could write itself. But the evidence is in front of you. This Bible, and it's clearly a Bible, a complete Vulgate in Latin, was produced using movable metal type. Individual letters cast in lead alloy, arranged into words, locked into a frame, inked and pressed onto paper. The same letters could be rearranged to print different pages. One set of type could theoretically print infinite copies. The process was faster, more consistent, and according to Guillaume, dramatically cheaper than manuscript production. You pick up the Gutenberg Bible and examine it with the critical eye of someone who spent 8 years creating manuscripts. The text is flawless. No variation in letter height, no wobbling baselines, no places where the scribe's hand cramped and the writing got shaky. The ink is perfectly even, applied with mechanical consistency rather than the slight variations of human brush or quill work. The margins are exactly the same width on every page. It's beautiful in a completely different way than manuscripts are beautiful. It's the beauty of precision, of reproducibility, of engineering triumph, and you hate it. You immediately, instinctively hate it because you understand what it means. It means everything you've learned is becoming obsolete. It means the 8 years you've invested in developing your scribal hand, your illumination skills, your ability to judge parchment quality and mix pigments and scrape errors without tearing skin. All of it is about to become unnecessary. Why would anyone commission a hand-copied manuscript when they could print multiple copies for a fraction of the cost and time? Why would anyone pay for your labor when a machine could do it better? The other scribes gather around, examining the printed Bible with similar expressions of fascinated horror. Brother Thomas, who's been copying manuscripts for 25 years, just shakes his head slowly. Brother Aldrich touches the printed letters like he's trying to understand how they were made, looking for evidence of human intervention in the mechanical perfection. You're all trying to process the same impossible fact. Human scribes are no longer the only way to reproduce text. Here's what historians debate about the printing revolution. How quickly did it actually replace manuscript production? The popular narrative is that Gutenberg invented the printing press in the 1450s and boom, manuscripts instantly became obsolete. The reality was more gradual. Printing was expensive to set up. You needed metal type, a press, paper supplies, skilled typesetters. Early printed books were still costly, still aimed at wealthy buyers who could afford them. For a few decades, manuscripts and printed books coexisted in a weird hybrid market, but the direction was clear. Within 50 years, the economics would shift completely. Printed books would become the standard, the expected format, the cheaper and faster option for almost every purpose. Manuscripts would survive only in specialized niches, highly personalized texts, extremely expensive luxury editions, documents that needed to look handmade for ceremonial reasons. The vast medieval industry of scriptoriums and parchment workshops and pigment suppliers would collapse, replaced by printing houses and paper mills and type foundries. You're watching your entire profession die in slow motion. And the weird thing is, part of you understands that this is progress. Printed books will make knowledge more accessible. They'll standardize texts, reducing copying errors. They'll enable mass literacy in a way manuscripts never could. The same Bible that took your Scriptorium 8 years to produce could be printed in months, multiple copies, sold at prices that middle-class merchants could afford. This is objectively good for society, but it's terrible for you personally. You've spent 8 years destroying your body to learn a skill set that's about to become as relevant as Stone Age flint knapping. The chronic pain in your hands, the vision problems, the lead exposure, the bent spine. You paid for these with the expectation that you'd have a lifelong profession. You'd be a master scribe, training younger monks, producing beautiful manuscripts, contributing valuable labor to your monastery's economy. Instead, you're going to be obsolete before you reach middle age. Guillaume seems to be thinking the same thing. What happens to us? Someone asks. Guillaume doesn't have an answer. The monastery will probably shift its scribes to other work. Administrative documents still need to be written by hand. Account books need maintaining. Correspondence needs copying. But the prestige work, the complex manuscript production that justified maintaining a full scriptorium, that's going to evaporate. The Bible you're currently working on might be the last hand-copied complete Bible this monastery ever produces. The Gutenberg Bible in front of you cost about the same to produce as a manuscript Bible would have. Early printing was still expensive because the technology was new and the economies of scale hadn't developed yet. But Gutenberg produced about 180 copies, 180 Bibles from the same effort that would have produced one manuscript. The math is devastating. Even if each individual printed copy was slightly more expensive to make than scribes calculated, the per-unit cost was a fraction of manuscript production. And as printing technology improved, those costs would only drop further. You notice something else about the printed Bible. It's on paper, not parchment. Some copies were printed on vellum for wealthy buyers, but most used paper which had been slowly infiltrating Europe through Islamic trade routes and Italian manufacturing. Paper was cheaper than parchment by an order of magnitude. No sheep had to die for these pages. No one spent weeks in the soak house scraping flesh and stretching skins. The entire brutal process of turning animals into writing surfaces could be skipped in favor of pulped rags and wood fibers pressed into sheets. 300 sheep for one manuscript Bible, 0 sheep for 180 printed Bibles. The environmental and economic implications are staggering. The Scriptorium continues operating, but the energy has changed. Everyone knows what's coming. You finish the commissioned Bible you're working on. It takes another year, and the whole time you're aware that this might be the last complete Bible you ever copy by hand. The patron who commissioned it is getting something increasingly rare, which actually makes it more valuable in a weird way. As printed books become common, hand-copied manuscripts will become luxury items, status symbols that prove you could afford the old, expensive method when the new, cheap method was available. You're not sure if that makes you feel better or worse about the situation. On one hand, your skills might remain valuable in a niche market. On the other hand, niche market is a very different thing from essential profession. You've gone from being a crucial part of how knowledge gets preserved and transmitted to being a luxury craftsman making expensive objects for rich people who want to show off. The spiritual dimension of the work, copying the Word of God, preserving sacred text, gets reduced to conspicuous consumption. The monastery starts diversifying. The abbot commissions a study of what other revenue sources might replace manuscript sales. More agriculture, maybe. Wool production, hosting pilgrims, producing medical remedies. Anything to replace the income that manuscript sales provided. The Scriptorium will probably shrink rather than disappear entirely. There will always be some demand for hand-copied documents, but it won't be the economic engine it once was. You watch younger monks making career decisions based on this new reality. Boys who might have trained as scribes are instead being directed toward other skills. The whole pipeline of scribe training is drying up because why would you invest years learning a profession that's being replaced by machines? The last generation of traditionally trained scribes is already working in the scriptoriums across Europe, and you're part of it. In 50 years, people with your specific skill set will be rare. In 100 years, they'll be essentially extinct. Brother Aldrich takes the change hardest. He's in his 60s. He's been an illuminator for 40 years, and his entire identity is wrapped up in the craft. Printed books can include illustrations, woodcut prints, engraved images, but they're different from hand-painted illumination. Cruder, less detailed, less individual. For a while, there's a hybrid market where printed books are sold undecorated and wealthy buyers hire illuminators to add hand-painted elements. Aldrich does some of this work, painting elaborate borders and decorated initials into printed books, which strikes you as deeply sad. He's spent his life mastering a complete craft, and now he's been reduced to decorating someone else's mechanical output. The last page you copy in the Scriptorium is from the Book of Revelation. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. The irony is not lost on you. The old world of manuscript production is passing away, and a new world of mechanical reproduction is emerging. You don't know if this new world is heaven or just different, but either way, you're living through the transition, and it's uncomfortable and disorienting and full of loss mixed with possibility. You add a final margin note, something for future readers if anyone ever examines this particular page closely enough to notice the tiny script along the edge. Made by hand in the year of our Lord, 1456. One of the last. You don't elaborate. Anyone reading this centuries later will either understand what you mean or they won't, and either way, the note stands as testimony. You were here. You did this work. The human labor embedded in these pages was real, even if the future doesn't need it anymore. Guillaume announces that the Scriptorium will reduce to half capacity next year. 4 scribes instead of 8. You're relatively young and competent, so you'll probably be kept on, but others will be reassigned. Brother Thomas, whose hands shake too badly for precise work anyway, will move to the library where he'll catalog and maintain books rather than create them. 2 of the younger scribes will transition to administrative work. The Scriptorium will become a smaller, more specialized operation, serving a shrinking market for hand-copied texts. The weird thing is how fast it happened. Just 10 years after Gutenberg's Bible appears, printing shops are opening across Europe. Venice becomes a major printing center. Paris develops a printing industry. Even smaller cities are getting presses. The technology spreads faster than almost any previous innovation because it's relatively simple. Once you understand the basic concept of movable type and mechanical pressing, you can replicate it. The knowledge barrier is low enough that the technology proliferates rapidly. You hear stories about other scriptoriums closing entirely. Some monasteries decide that manuscript production is no longer economically viable and convert their scriptoriums into other kinds of workshops. Some scribes find employment in the printing houses. Someone needs to proofread. Someone needs to understand text layout. Someone needs expertise in book production, even if the method has changed. But the transition is rough, and not everyone makes it successfully. The 300 sheep that died for the Bible you just completed represent a kind of peak and endpoint. Peak because manuscript production reached incredible levels of sophistication and quality in the 15th century. The last generation of scribes produced some of the most beautiful books ever made. Endpoint because this model of production is about to be replaced entirely. Future Bibles won't require sheep at all, just paper and ink and mechanical pressure. The animal cost, the environmental impact, the months and years of human labor, all of it will become unnecessary, replaced by a faster, cheaper, more replicable process. You think about the sheep sometimes, which probably seems strange. But you've spent so much time working with parchment, learning to recognize quality, understanding the connection between the living animal and the writing surface, that they've become real to you in a way they probably aren't to most people. 300 deaths for one book. In the new world of printing, that calculation will seem absurd, wasteful, a relic of a less efficient age. But it was your world. It was how things worked. And now it's ending. The Scriptorium feels emptier, even though everyone is still working. There's a sense of winding down, of completing the last projects before the transition. You're all going through the motions of manuscript production while knowing that the process itself is becoming historical, something that will soon be described in past tense. This is how they used to make books, someone will say, pointing to a manuscript in a museum. Before printing, and your entire profession will be reduced to that. Before. The room is quieter now, the kind of quiet that settles in when a story has found its natural resting place. The Scriptorium exists in memory, in the museums where these manuscripts sleep behind glass, in the margin, notes left by hands that cramped and trembled and kept working anyway. 300 sheep, countless hours, a profession that rose and fell across centuries, all of it transformed into something you can hold in your hands, pages that survived when the people who made them didn't. You can still see those manuscripts today, if you know where to look. The gold still gleams. The ink, even after 600 or 700 years, remains black and sharp. The parchment, properly cared for, outlasts paper by centuries. Those scribes succeeded in their impossible task. They created objects that would endure, that would carry words across time in a way that human memory never could. The cost was real. In animal lives, in human health, in years of labor that could have been spent doing almost anything else. But the result was real too. The printing press didn't erase what came before. It just made it precious in a different way, turned necessity into art, transformed the everyday into the extraordinary. Somewhere in a library, there's a Bible that cost 300 sheep to make, and it sits next to a printed Bible that cost none. Both contain the same words. Only one contains all that suffering, all that patience, all those tiny rebellions hidden in the margins where tired scribes left traces of their humanity. Now the lights are low. The story has been told. And somewhere in the space between waking and dreaming, you can almost hear the scratch of quills on parchment, the soft scrape of knives on skin, the silence of rooms where cold men did impossible work because someone had to, and they were the ones who knew how. Rest well. The manuscripts are safe. The words survived, and the people who made them, well, they're in the margins if you know where to look.